The identity of America is deeply rooted in the tenets of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. People from around the world come to the U.S. hoping to achieve the American dream. Yet despite its promises, many people have had to fight for America to live up to the ideals of liberty and equality for all. Leaders like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks became famous for their pursuits of civil rights. Here are some civil rights leaders who were lesser known, but who were instrumental to their causes. Josephine Ruffin was born in 1842 to a white mother and a black father from Martinique. She was raised in Boston and made very important contributions to the advancement of civil rights, especially for African American women. During the Civil War, she and her husband, George Lewis Ruffin, the first black man to graduate from Harvard Law, recruited freed slaves to join the Union Army. After the war, she used her status to support the women's suffrage movement. She founded and was the editor of Women's Era, the first newspaper published by and for African American women. She was also very devoted to the Women's Club movement, which established the idea that women had a moral duty and responsibility to transform public policy. In 1894, she organized the Women's Era Club, an advocacy group for African American women, and fostered the merger of similar clubs around the country, helping lead to the formation of the NAACP in February of 1909. Carter G. Woodson was an author and historian, known as the father of Black history. The son of freed slaves, one of Dr. Woodson's core beliefs was that it was important for Blacks to know their past in order to help African Americans achieve freedom and equality. He founded the Journal of Negro History, an important source for Black history research programs. It also corrected the work of white scholars who misrepresented or incorrectly analyzed the lives of enslaved people and the history of Black culture. On February 7, 1926, he helped form Negro History Week, which would grow into Black History Month, celebrated today in the U.S. and even abroad in the U.K., Ireland, and the Netherlands. In his 1933 book, The Miseducation of the Negro, he encouraged and challenged African Americans to do for themselves, regardless of what they were taught in schools. A. Philip Randolph was a labor leader and social activist, widely known as a spokesperson for the African American working class. In 1911, at the age of 22, he moved to New York City with dreams of becoming an actor. That career didn't pan out, but the lessons he learned made him a great leading man in the fight for the civil rights movement. He founded the first labor union led by African Americans called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in 1925. He was instrumental in the desegregation of the defense industry and the integration of the armed forces. And he organized the March on Washington in 1963, where MLK delivered his I Have a Dream speech. Many call Randolph the true father of the civil rights movement because he showed future activists that nonviolent protests and mass demonstrations were an effective way to mobilize public pressure. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964. Ella Baker was a civil rights activist from the time she was a student in the 1920s up until her death in 1983. She played a key role in several influential civil rights organizations, including the NAACP and MLK's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In 1960, Ella was inspired by the group of Black students in North Carolina who launched the sit-in movement. She met with them, believing that young activists were a great asset to the movement, and helped form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC organized the Freedom Rides of 1961. Many other demonstrations aimed at focusing national attention on racism and voting rights, and became one of the foremost advocates for human rights in the country. Baker's lasting legacy was showing how group action could counter violence. The Ella Baker Center for Human Rights in Oakland, California, aims at continuing her legacy for a long time to come. Willa Brown flew onto the civil rights scene as a pioneer in the field of aeronautics. She began taking flying lessons as a hobby outside of Chicago, which would become the epicenter of Black aviation. And in 1938, she became the first Black woman to be licensed as a private pilot in the U.S. There were a number of Black female pilots before her, but they were forced to receive their licenses in Europe. She co-founded the National Airmen's Association of America during the mid-1930s and opened the Coffey School of Aeronautics, which was the first flight school owned and operated by African Americans. Many of her students would go on to form the Tuskegee Airmen and be part of the famous fighter squadron known as the Red Tails. She was a tireless advocate of desegregating the air, and in 1948, her dream was realized in part when President Truman ordered the full integration of the armed forces with the Executive Order 9981. Dolores Huerta was born in New Mexico in 1930 and has spent most of her life as a civil rights activist, labor leader, and feminist, and is still active as she enters her 9th decade. Dolores began working as a teacher, but was disturbed watching many of her students come to school hungry. Her career as an activist was born. She fought for economic improvements for Latinx, Mexican, and Chicano migrant farm workers, co-founding the National Farm Workers Association with Cesar Chavez in 1962, organizing several impactful strikes, and supporting laws in favor of better wages and conditions for farm workers. She is a champion of women's rights, advocating for Latina women to run for political office and working for civil rights for all women. She has been honored with the Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and she was the first Latina inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 1993. In 1955, Claudette Colvin was 15 years old, living in Montgomery, Alabama. While riding the bus, she refused to give up her seat to a white person. She was arrested and thrown in jail. It's almost a mirror image to the story of Rosa Parks, except Claudette's ride occurred 9 months earlier on March 2nd. Claudette explained that at her segregated school, she was learning the stories of Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, both former slaves turned abolitionist and women's rights activists. She said she could feel the two women holding her down on the bus seat that day. Turns out, several women had refused to cede their seats, but Black leaders decided Parks, who was a field secretary and organizer at the NAACP and middle class, should be the face of this chapter of the civil rights movement. Nevertheless, Claudette is a great example that anybody can make a difference. These are just a few of the many, many people who bravely fought and continue to fight to this day for all the people who live in this great country, and they deserve great recognition and respect. We can learn lessons from all of them about making the world a more accepting place. Now go forth, be well, and do good.